So I'm starting. So the recording, someone started the recording again. What does that feel?
Yeah, I thought we were starting.
Yeah, good. Great. So welcome everybody. Welcome to the 6th LTSIG Friday, which is a series of webinars that the LTSIG committee has put together. We are the Learning Technology Special Interest Group of ITEFL. ITEFL stands for the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language. And we are the Learning Technology Specialist Interest Group, as I said. In this series of webinars, we share advice and best practice on how to make teaching a better experience for teachers and students during the pandemic, especially for those who had to move their face-to-face classes online in a very short time. So we are here to support you, and we will be talking about technology, online pedagogies, affordances, implications. So during the webinar, feel free to interact with other participants, ask questions that Gary will be happy to answer later on. And please let us know how we can support you during this transition stage, what topics you would like us to consider for next webinars. So without further ado, I will pass the mic to Nikki, who will introduce the one and only Gary Motteram.
Oh, thank you, Sophia. Yeah, well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Gary Motteram, speaking on behalf of the SIG this afternoon. Gary is a senior lecturer at the Manchester Institute of Education, and his research interests lie in the area of language teacher education at a distance. And this afternoon, he's going to be talking to us about what we can learn about teaching online from organisations and teachers working in challenging contexts. And as Sophia said, if you do have questions, pop them into the chat box, because there will be time for discussion at the end. So without further ado, let me hand over to Gary.
Okay, thank you, Nikki, and thank you, Sophia. I feel, thank you for that kind of introduction. As I guess a lot of people know, I've got quite a long background in learning technologies, and for many years was actively involved in the Learning Technology SIG as well. So I feel that this is my kind of home space. So hold on, let me just deal with that. Sorry, I've done something wrong here, so I'm not showing off my credentials. Okay, so I'm one of the issues that I am involved in, or one of the topics I'm involved in research.
Gary, we're seeing your desktop at the moment.
Okay, I'll move that across there then. Is that better?
Fantastic, thank you.
Okay, so at the moment, and probably for many years, I've been involved in looking at the ways that we can use lower tech technologies. And as it said, if you've read my little introduction, it's not that I'm not interested in AI or robots or other kinds of technologies that kind of cutting edge technologies. But I think we can learn a lot from other places, other organizations, by kind of engaging with perhaps a lower tech starting point. So I'm going to go through various points. I'm going to talk about some of the research that we've been doing. I'm going to mention some particular organizations that I think are very helpful and very useful, and some ideas around particularly distance learning, because that's what I tend to call it. Reflects, I suppose, where I come from and the work that I do. But I also think there's a valid reason for calling it that. But I'm also going to talk about, as I say, various sort of projects that I've been involved in and what we've learned from them. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to do a couple of tasks, not many. Let me see if I can show I want to be able to see the actual chat at the same time. So can you type in the text chat? Can you type in what you think this acronym stands for? ICT for D. And I can't see. I'm going to stop sharing a second so I can pop out the So what do you think ICT for D stands for? What do you think? Yeah, somebody's got it in one, so somebody's obviously well aware of it. Yes, yeah, so it stands for Information and Communication Technology, ICT, for development. Okay, and this is something. Then this is an area of work that is very much allied to the work we do, and people who work in this kind of area do very similar things to what we do. They use technology, but they use it in places and spaces perhaps that we don't. So they don't work in the private sector, they may work in higher education, they work probably in school education, in countries around the world, or where most people work, in fact, in places with very large numbers of students in classes, with teachers who might have some teacher training, might have no teacher training, but essentially looking at ways of employing ICT for development. Now, it ranges across, it's not just about language teaching. I mean, I do work still focusing on language teaching and the role that these kind of technologies can play in supporting particularly teachers in contexts of difficult circumstances. But it can be related to agriculture, it can be related to pandemics, and so on and so forth. So people look at using tools like, all sorts of tools on mobile apps, in the way that people are developing tracing apps at the moment, looking at all sorts of different ways of using technology for education. And one of the related reasons that people do this is because of these Sustainable Development Goals. Can people see these Sustainable Development Goals on the screen as I click between them? Can you tell me that? Because I can't actually see the chat at the moment. So. Yeah, so somebody, can you see the
yeah, we can, Gary.
Okay, all right, so let me just do this. So as you see there, perhaps people are familiar with this anyway, but we focus on Sustainable Development Goal 4, and this is about trying to, in most cases, it's mostly about trying to get children into education as well as trying to improve standards. But part of that particular Sustainable Development Goal is actually working with teachers. And one of the reasons why I like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Development Goals that preceded them weren't quite as helpful, was because they actually, they say, well, teachers make a difference. For many years, you've seen the sort of neoliberal developments of education where, teachers are just part and parcel of the system. Their role is just to, do the stuff that central governments often expect them to do. So, these are sorts of issues that were part of Millennium Development Goals. So a lot of the Millennium Development was trying to get people to actually turn up to classrooms, to get children and teachers to turn up, whereas people began to do research and investigation and realized that teachers made a difference. So that's partly why I look at that, but it's also interesting. Now, one of the other special interest groups of IATEFL is called the Global Issues Special Interest Group, and they do a lot of work looking at developing materials for work in classrooms, and they also do quite a lot of work around technology as well. So I come across people in the Global Issues SIG working in the same sorts of places that I work in and using some of the similar technology. So if you're interested, I'll put up a link to these slides. So these are Google slides, so I can put a link up to them and I can share them, and you can have a look. You can click on these links and look at the Global Issues material. So I'm going to step back for a moment and look at a couple of people and their ideas, because I learned from these ideas, and I think it's useful for people to engage with these ideas at all. There's a guy called Michael Trucano. He works for the World Bank, and he's their go-to guy for ICT for D. And he's got a very interesting blog. So again, you can click on the link on his name above there when I give you this. and you can actually look at the detail. It comes out with lots of interesting stuff. And you know, he's obviously writing now about COVID-19, but he was writing about other things as well. And they have on this website, they have these lists of 10 things. The 10th one is always, you know, what do you think kind of thing. But this is a very useful, I found these very useful, these sort of 9 ideas. And they probably chime a lot with things you probably think anyway, but I think it's useful to see. It's always useful to compare across different disciplines. So we have a tendency in language teaching, particularly English language teaching, to sort of sit within our own world, whereas actually there are lots of interesting things going on out there. But you know, it actually confirms that maybe some of the things we do are right. So you know, because it's partly sort of conditioned by the particular context you find yourself in, but things like the best technology is the one you already have, know how to use and can afford. And this is often something that there does tend to be this, I mean, at the moment in universities, we're doing a lot of work with virtual reality. Well, again, I've got nothing against virtual reality, but we get to a situation where the University of Manchester locked down and many other universities and schools locked down. And we find a lot of, never mind the students, but a lot of the academic staffs don't actually have a computer that's capable of running Zoom, for example. So, you know, had quite a lot of this. There have been quite a lot of panic buying of technology to enable people to do that. So in some ways, you know, if we're going to actually learn from these kinds of processes, this is the sort of thing to think about. So, you know, start where you're at. So if you're going to go in and do a project, you're going to go and do some work. So if you're going to move your material online, then, you know, and a lot of people have had to do that anyway, but essentially it's work with what you know. Don't try and sort of try something new, you know, from the kickoff. The next one, start down and out and then move up and in. That's essentially a model of working with trying to start small and then expand. So try and see whether it works, sort of like run pilots, so have a go, you know, with quickly set up some material and then expand that. So get it working first in a particular community and then expand. You know, so we get back to this issue about teachers. If you treat teachers like a problem, then they will be. So often we exclude teachers from any kind of discussion. Again, that's happening at my own university at the moment. We're getting these messages coming from the central authorities telling us this, that, and the other. As far as most of us can see, without very little consultation with the people actually doing the job. So, you know, the more buy-in you get from people in the baseline, and also recognizing the skills that people have. One of the things that we tend not to do is actually, you know, look at and recognize the skills that people have. So the next one, pretty obvious. So, you know, again, it's not about the technology, it's about what you put into the technology that matters. You know, if you start off, you know, trying to do something, so number 5, if you're pointed in the wrong direction, technology may help you to get there more quickly. So it's quite often possible to use technology in ways that mean that you don't achieve anything. So you just achieve nothing more quickly. So we put technology in place and we don't actually solve the problem that we're trying to solve, instead of, you know, going back to the point about what is it we're trying to achieve, what technologies do we have available, what's possible to do. Next one, about Matthew effects. Well, these are essentially effects that are described in the literature where you talk about it tends to, introducing new things tends to privilege people who already have access. So if you look in developing world contexts, you find that children, middle-class children who live in cities, who probably go to quite well-resourced schools, benefit from the contribution. So if you have money that's brought in as part of development projects, it's often the middle classes that benefit, not the children who really need it, who live out in the villages with no access to technology whatsoever. You often have to fail to understand things. So again, you know, and learn from that. So it doesn't matter. Lots of projects don't work first time, but, you know, sort of adjust them and change them. And one of the things that I've done over the last sort of 8 years is I've gradually kind of grown things from an initial start and I'll talk a little bit about the bits that I've done in a bit. Sustainability is very important. So again, when you're using technology, this is again sort of something about project work, but it's true, of materials development. There's no point creating materials if they're not going to last. So, I mean, one of the things that's kind of weird about what we're talking about when we talk about COVID-19 is, well, this is temporary, we're only going to do this for a year. Well, then why bother putting the time and investment into doing it? It's better to sort of think about, well, how can we make this work? How can we, this is actually a golden opportunity for people to actually do the sort of things that, this community has been talking about for a long time. This was something I said many years ago about putting old wine into new bottles when it came to technology. We do have a tendency of repeating the bad things. So, we find a super duper way to create multiple choice questions. Not to say that necessarily all multiple choice questions are bad things, but we do tend to replicate bad practice. And it's very easy to do that often with technology. So if you look at a lot about, it's my problem with things like AI and robots. AI and robots, what are they doing? They're tending to do the same sort of things that we did with multiple choice sort of gap filling exercises a few years ago. So if I had time, I would have said, well, let's come up with some ideas for number 10. And if I'd been doing this with a group of students, we'd now go into breakout rooms to actually brainstorm that. But we're probably not going to be able to do that. So maybe, because I can't actually see the chat at the moment, you might want to sort of put some ideas in there. So, if you're thinking about it, what might go, what other things might go into number 10? So here is then another acronym. So let me just stop the share so I can actually see what people say here. So what about this acronym, INEE? Anybody know what that is as the people come back?
We can't see it, Gary.
You can't see it, but
no.
Yeah, okay, let me show it again then.
Yeah, we can see it now. Thank you.
INEE. What do you think that acronym stands for? Okay, so somebody's got that there, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. So, okay, that's exactly what it does stand for. So this organization then is an umbrella organization, and it works, as it implies, with different communities that work in education for emergencies. So at the moment, very active in looking at how to manage the millions of children who aren't in the privileged situation of kids in the UK, many of whom do have access to internet and technology, but children who have absolutely nothing. So they're out of school, but they've got no access to anything. So this is the kind of work that they do. And again, I mean, like most people, I've been attending sort of webinars. You're attending this one, I've attended some others, and there was a very good one. They're actually doing some very good webinars, I think some of the better ones. I would recommend these quite a lot. You can find them online, again, through the link. The other group that I would recommend are the Eden ones as well. They're very good. So what was interesting for me was the terms that Jacqueline Strecker and she was from UNESCO, used. So she did the introductory talk. And she used the term distance. So I like that because, of course, as I said to you, I do like the term distance. And one of the things that so often, is something that people don't do is that they don't actually ever read the literature. So there is a massive literature out there about distance education. It's been around a long time. Yes, it has moved in various ways, and now a lot of it's online. It's virtual. But it's an important sort of starting point. So we learned a lot from doing that. So the kind of all sorts of kind of people who have been part of that have contributed there. But the term I also liked a lot was connected. So it's a very important part of it. It's that connectivity. Now, Alan Tate, who did an Eden talk last week, I think it was, a couple of weeks ago. He used to work at the Open University. He talked about that idea of connectedness. Graham, who's also in the audience here, talked about that notion of empathy and connectedness, making that connection. So that's the kind of key thing that I think, and it was interesting to see that. And she talked about different models. So she talks about self-guided, differentiated, blended, facility-based. Now, of course, at the moment, we can't do facility-based, although maybe as schools begin to open, that kind of mixture is going to be something, what we would call kind of online blended learning would be important. But what, again, struck me is if you look at the list of tools, then the first one there is radio. Now, I guess it's not something that people in an EdTech world necessarily sort of think about immediately, but actually, if you broaden the notion of radio to include audio, like podcasts, for example, and then, as they say in the distant literature, you wrap something around that. So maybe you mix radio with SMS messaging. So if you're in a context where people don't have access to the internet, and there are lots of children in Europe, in the UK, in other parts of Europe, who don't have access to the internet in other parts of the world. That's true. We've got people here from India and South America, I noticed. So, there are lots of people who don't have that. So the ability, not necessarily to use radio, because that's kind of difficult to kind of set up and run quickly, but looking at audio and wrapping things around that is something to think about. And also using in environments. Again, I went to an interesting talk where somebody was using a whiteboard, not an electronic whiteboard, but actually using, what they use in a lot of primary schools, a square board, cardboard, shiny with reusable pens. So, these sorts of things are available to us, and we should be thinking about doing them. She also had an interesting set of questions. This was kind of addressing things at quite a high level. So she was talking about, if you're talking to a government, and these, of course, NGOs, big NGOs like UNESCO and other NGOs of that type, War Child Holland, those kinds of types of NGOs who do a lot of work in this kind of area. They are talking to governments about these kinds of things. But it struck me that these questions were also really useful for us to ask ourselves. What's being prioritized? What are the things that we should prioritize in a particular context? Again, back to this question of resources, what do people have? And then this business of how can we make sure everybody, nobody left behind. That's the sort of kind of catchphrase of, education these days. But how do you, encourage people to do that? So, using some of those technologies I've just mentioned. So what do we do first? What do we do first? So maybe we immediately everybody starts using Zoom, and we word of the year this year will be Zoom bombing. But having done that, what can we do next? How can we sort of move a bit more towards something that's a bit less frenetic, a bit more kind of engaged and things like that. So, what do we create today? If we're creating things today, how does that potentially link to what we're doing, next week or when the semester starts again in September? So rather than just creating something immediately for use in one context, we think about how we might utilize that later. And then what are the hidden costs? And we're not just talking about costs in terms of financial costs. We're talking about, the costs of sitting at a screen all day long, the mental costs, so the psychosocial costs of kids being out of school. So not only are they losing education, but a lot of children are losing access to food. Sad to say, in this country, the UK, 1 in 5 children go to school hungry, and they have to be fed at school. And if they're not fed at school, they don't get fed. And so there are lots of costs involved there. So I mean, those sorts of things are worth remembering in all of this kind of stuff. So again, I think like a teacher, I was thinking of your specific context, how you might apply Strecker's questions to it. So again, something hopefully you can think about and we could do somewhere. So another useful webinar I went to recently, again, I mentioned Eden. This is Lisa Marie Blackscher, who works in Germany, originally from the US. But she talked about, Biggs's model of constructive alignment. I don't know whether people are familiar with John Biggs, but he's quite a big name in higher education. And she kind of re-represented it in this kind of way. So essentially, she talked about backwards design. So you start with the learning outcomes. What do you want to achieve? And then you go back to that. And the same thing is true with technology as well. So, what you're doing, you're starting with your learning, outcomes. You're considering the kind of types of assessment you want to do. What do you want to do? How are you going to assess that? And I don't necessarily mean formal assessment. It could be informal assessment. And then you look at the learning activities. And the same then is also true with choosing technology. So when we work with our local academics at the University of Manchester, we take that model. We say, okay, focus on the teaching, pick the technology last. So, if robots are going to work, then use them. But in many situations, robots won't be the answer. So, you don't walk into the classroom with a group of trainee teachers and say, here's a robot, how are you going to use it in the classroom? Again, I guess most of you would think about that. Anyway, you wouldn't sort of think any differently about that than I would. So here's another person. Again, I don't know whether you come across Tony Bates. Tony Bates, again, a sort of ex-Open University UK person. And he's got some very useful materials online, got a fantastic blog, and he has an open source textbook called Teaching in a Digital Age. So again, you can either kind of write this down or you can get hold of these slides. And over time, he's sort of developed his thinking about these kind of areas. And he's got this chart. You can see this chart. It's a self-published book. It's not sort of fantastic graphic, but he's looking at what do you start with first? You start with the students. You look at ease of use. You look at how much is this going to cost? How much time is it going to take? You then look at the kind of media. You look at interaction. You look at can these things actually be run in your university? I mean, one of the big questions in my world, in the European world, maybe in other parts of the world as well, are issues to do with GDPR. I mean, one of the talks I went to that Graham did, he was talking about safeguarding issues, thinking about how to safeguard children. So that's kind of front and center of any teaching that the British Council do. Then looking at issues like, the networks, how they work, and then again, security and privacy. So, he's got some really interesting work here. There's a nice chapter where he talks about the planning and the process. So again, Tony is somebody who works in the developing world. This was originally sort of set up to run, or his thinking came out of work he did at the Open University, but these are also things that he could do. So I'm kind of conscious that time is getting on, so I'm not going to go through all the links here, but the INE website has some very good examples of the use of radio in education, for example. So if that's not something you've sort of thought about before, and again, as I say, you don't have to see it as radio, sort of podcasts, or that's the kind of term we might use these days, but also some very good reviews of of materials. So there's a UNESCO website with lots of examples of free or open source technologies that you can use. So I would recommend, if you've not visited those, they have some very good resources that we can dip into. So there's a million of pieces of advice out there already, but actually some of these are quite well organized and coordinated, so I would recommend them to you. So I'm then going to briefly talk about 3 projects that I've been involved in and the sort of things that we've learned from them. So one project featured work we did in Pakistan. This was working with the British Council, but this was teaching groups of trainee teachers, working with teachers trying to upgrade their skills. And it was at a time when we weren't actually allowed to go anywhere in Pakistan. Most of the work was done from, in my case, I flew all the way to Pakistan, and I spent most of my time in a hotel room looking at Skype. And eventually I said, this is crazy. I shouldn't be doing this. And we did the rest of the project on Skype. But the reason we chose Skype was because teachers had access to it. And what we did, and it wasn't in the sense of individual Skype access. This was teacher centres. So all of these teachers had access to a local teacher centre, and they had to go in to that teacher centre once a month to do various administrative tasks. So they were required to attend a session every Saturday, and the British Council negotiated to have a bit of space in that day to actually do some teacher development. And that was done, it was multiple ways. So we had a group of 10 people in a room physically, or 20 people in a room physically in a city in the region of Lahore. We had another group in another city, and we had another group in another city. And actually what we did, again, I mentioned Graham again, but we used, or I was aware of the Plan Sibel on Inglés project and the work they did with remote teaching, and I used that model. So I took an existing model. I didn't, try and reinvent the wheel. I said, okay, let's take an existing model. And I was conscious that that was a very high-tech model. That was something that had been made very clear. And I thought, okay, well, let's try and do that in a lower tech way with technology that people had. And so, we successfully set up these training courses, and we were able to do things. And we learned certain things about that. So we had, like you have in the Plan Sibel, you have a remote person. So there's a coordinator in the same way here. We have a coordinator. So you had, the person sitting in an office doing the presentation, and you had other people in these different spaces acting as facilitators of the process. But what we also brought in was SMS. So we did a survey, and it was amongst the teachers, but we were also conscious of availability of mobile phones. So we then brought SMS in. So that gave an individualized process. So teachers who maybe didn't feel they could put their hand up in the class, the remote class, so they felt a bit disassociated with it, they could send in text messages. So again, you're taking a fairly low-tech kind of solution from a different space. So you're taking, ideas from one space and you're adapting them to another. And as far as I know, that is still working. It's still being successful. The second thing, so these links here go to different slides. So if you want to sort of get more detail of it, you can do that. So all of these are linked through together and they're shareable. So the second project I did, so I picked this up from ideas that I thought, it was around the time of the Ebola crisis. And I thought, oh, couldn't we use mobile phones for children who are stuck at home and isolated? And I looked for a context where we might be able to do this. Again, it's sort of teacher education. It's not directly teaching students. And we worked in the Zaatari refugee camp. And initially, yeah, there were visits, so you could sort of say it was a bit blended. But essentially, we worked remotely using WhatsApp. So it was trying out WhatsApp there. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So these were some of the findings. Again, I won't labor this. I mean, if you want to, we've got a paper coming out about this. But essentially, there were certainly issues around WhatsApp. WhatsApp itself, because it's the fact that it's a piece of social media, that causes problems. People are used to being social on social media. So adjusting people's ideas to actually saying, okay, how do we make this into an educational process can be difficult. So you're probably all members of sort of social media groups, and people will, I mean, I talk about, we have WeChat groups with our Chinese students. We talk about the dancing dogs, so please no more dancing dogs. This is not about dancing dogs. This is an academic environment. So, there's that there's a kind of tension there. There's a dialectic, as they would say in the kind of Marxist literature, between, that contradiction between the fact that you want to use the social to create social presence, like they say in the distance learning literature, but actually it gets too social, and you lose the kind of focus on the actual academic side of it. I mean, there were sort of specific local issues there in terms of that quite a few of the teachers didn't have good access to the internet. And we were trying to make this project sustainable. So the idea was that when we left, it would keep going. Unfortunately, it didn't. That was the reality of the particular situation. But we did learn a lot about using WhatsApp, and we're still sort of applying that. So we've got other projects that we're working on. So, we used it for exchanging ideas, designing lesson plans, so teachers engaged in talking about sort of designing lesson plans online. And, don't forget, WhatsApp's quite sophisticated. It's a multimedia space, a multimodal space, as they say in the literature. So it's got text, it's got pictures, it's got video, it's got sound. So you can use it in quite sophisticated ways. So all these things we did. We practiced language, we're running training sessions, sharing materials, and so on. So it's got, you can do everything in WhatsApp that you do in a traditional, VLE. So it's a sort of mobile VLE. So we have also been working more recently in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is a project that was an extension of what we were doing. So, I mean, I took ideas from the Skype work in Pakistan. We then adapted those to work in Jordan. So we did try and use Skype in Jordan as well, but for various reasons we weren't able to do that. Don't know why. But now in the sub-Saharan African project, we're trying to put those things together in a more sophisticated way. So we've done a fair amount of work with that. So there is a group, a teacher association called Sinelta in Côte d'Ivoire that's now been running. The WhatsApp group has been running for quite a long time now and has developed in all sorts of ways. But we're also using it on an existing project. And we're using the term teacher, or looking at the term resilience, or the teacher resilience. And that's a very interesting area. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but if you want to sort of look at the extent of, there is actually a report there that you can read. But if I just nip back to here, let me just show you one of the connectivities. So I'm just sort of trying to show you the connectivity between the sort of work that we were doing. So this is a long presentation, but what we did, this idea around resilience, we took from the ICT for D literature. So here there's Gary bringing it back round in a circle to show you, why I'm talking about these things. So we took this rabbit model, which was developed by a guy at Manchester who works within, that bigger field of development in education. And him, along with other colleagues, they developed these ideas that they call rabbit. So robustness, self-organization, and learning. So it's a really nice model. So we utilize that model, trying to utilize that model in that report. If you're interested, you can read the report. You can show how, we use that model as a way of analyzing our data set. So we set that up, and it proved quite useful in terms of, for example, there are things, WhatsApp is quite reliable. So we kept trying to use Zoom because we wanted to develop and use Zoom. This was before everybody started using Zoom. We were trying to develop that idea, partly because it works in very low bandwidth context. But we found that it didn't work. So WhatsApp, we could always rely on WhatsApp. Even if Zoom wasn't working, WhatsApp did. And so if, the Zoom session fell, we had the backup again. Graham mentioned this, the idea of a backup plan. We always had that backup, and we could do quite sophisticated things with it. So there, again, there's sort of lots of data in there. So there are other things in this rabbit model. So including, the ability to do things at speed. So, for example, we ran an online conference with groups of teachers from 6 different countries in June last year. Seems such a long time ago now, but we had 6 groups of teachers. So again, it was a bit like the model in Pakistan. We had, you know, groups of 10 teachers in 6 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We brought them together through Zoom and with WhatsApp as a backup, and we did various tasks and activities. And we were able to set that up almost overnight. So, you know, we said to somebody, oh, would you set us up a WhatsApp group? So somebody who was part of the community did that. We didn't have to do it ourselves. So a lot of the background work was done by people in the local context. And that seems to me to be a really good model to work with. So it works with the kind of stuff that we're talking about. Okay, so, you know, back to our starting points in a way. So back to Trucano. So Trucano, his work, those 10 points kind of really sort of resonated with me quite a few years ago now. I think back to the time when I was first doing reading about this. I think those points were still there. And then I was really kind of, in a sense, I was very pleased to see that Strecker was talking about the same kind of ideas that I talk about in terms of, you know, using distance education. So there's a reference there to BIGS. It's not linked, and there is some stuff I'm sort of pointing at the screen now, assuming you can see that, which of course you can't. There's some contact details from me. There's the TAPE project, where we write up some of the work we've done in sub-Saharan Africa, linked to some of my publications. And then I've also started a little wiki, you know, old-fashioned PB Works wiki that's actually trying to bring together materials. So a lot of the materials that I've referenced here today, you can find links to in that. So I promised I wouldn't talk for too long, and I hope I haven't, you know, by sort of skipping over a few things, I hope I've managed to keep it coherent, but I'm going to stop there and see what questions we've got, and so we can have decent time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you for this very interesting session. Vicky, have you been collecting? Yeah.
Yes, I have a few questions, and you can still type questions in the chat box while we speak. So the first is, you suggested a couple of groups for a very interesting webinars. One was INEE, and the other, I'm not sure about, people were asking. I think it was Eden. Was that the other group you recommended? Okay.
Yes, it's the European Distance Education Network. So it's the European community of distance practitioners. They're a very interesting group. They're a big group, and they've been running for very many years, and they're obviously doing a lot of webinars, but because they're connected into Europe, they have quite a lot of really good speakers there. I would also recommend a lot of the British Council talks as well. I mean, particularly Graham's. I thought Graham's was excellent. You know, so I've quoted from it a few times, but you know, it's good to hear people saying the same thing. So I tend to go to ones that I think are going to be interesting. But Eden, and you can catch them, you know, they're recorded, so you can catch them online. But the INE ones, you know, they're quite specialist in some ways. They do very much refer to the particular context of people working in refugee camps or with asylum seekers. So they are dealing with, you know, so they do look at things like psychosocial issues. So, you know, looking at ways of managing the stress that people have when they're dislocated, which of course, you know, we're all suffering. So some of those things are kind of relevant, maybe not to the extent necessarily that people, you know, in a refugee camp would be suffering, but still we can learn a lot from those materials. They're very good materials.
Yeah, I think that we are sometimes so absorbed in our own ELT context that we forget to look beyond that into a wider educational or world for resources, yes, that can inform us as much or even more.
And it also helps to reinforce, you know, our ideas. So, you know, if we look at an allied subject like ICT for D, and we think, oh, they're saying the same sort of things that we say.
Yeah.
You know, you think, oh, well, you know, two independent communities sort of come together and say the same things. That adds strength to it. And one thing to say about the work around resilience was that when we looked at work around resilience in school teaching, when we looked at the literature there, it was mostly about pre-service education, and we were interested in service. And it wasn't about, how do you maintain resilience? It was about, developing early stage resilience to stop teachers walking away, once they're trained. It's an expensive business. So we were looking for models that would help us.
I have a question from Elaine. And she was asking if WhatsApp is the most universal communicative tool, even among the most bereft of tech. I know it is in Argentina, so maybe, I don't know if everywhere.
Well, it's not everywhere. I mean, one of the things that I find interesting, because I work these days, mostly with Chinese students. We have lots and lots of Chinese students doing our master's degrees.
So you should do WeChat.
So we use WeChat. So, I mean, so I use whatever tool is relevant to the context. And that's exactly what I do. So, and it's very interesting when I go to sessions, I've been to several sessions where people keep talking about Google. And I'm thinking, well, if you're using Google with Chinese students, it ain't going to work. Because they can't access it, or they can, but they have to have a VPN. And, you're asking them to spend extra money.
For trouble. And you're asking for trouble,
And they're also potentially asking for trouble. So, I try and find alternative ways around them. I'm getting them to teach me how to use, we use VOOV as well, which is this. It is actually Zoom because it's programmed by the same people, but it's the Chinese equivalent of it. It's not
exactly.
So it depends on where you're looking at. So Line is another one, and then there's what's the other one that they use a lot in the Middle East? It's got a Telegram. So in Iran, my wife communicates with her friends in Telegram. So when I was doing a project in Iran for a while, I used Telegram.
We and Elaine is saying that we look for the functionalities we need, and we find what's the tool that exists already.
Absolutely, yes.
People use.
Absolutely, and that's the point. It's what do I need to do? What's the availability in terms of, if I've got to access people who are in the last mile, as they say in the development literature. So in a village, quite a long way from the mast. So what technology might work? Well, maybe audio plus text messages would be a better solution, rather than trying to say, oh, we'll buy all these tablets and we'll ship them in, and they can't even charge them. And this has happened so many times. We can all think of, there are thousands of projects where that has happened. And if you look for 5 minutes on an ICT, do a trawl of ICT for D literature, you'll find that kind of recommendation, sort of front and center. It's not difficult to find these things.
Absolutely. Well, I have one question, and this is from myself. And you were saying that the Jordan project kind of died away when you finished. And I'm interested because it's happened to me to lead a few projects that I think I was the soul of the project, and then when I left, the projects died away. So what do you think is necessary to keep these projects going? Because they seem to be very valuable. Well,
I mean, the problem, I mean, I could talk for quite a long time about some of the issues. I mean, one of the biggest issues was the lack of interagency kind of engagement in Jordan. So although the camps were run by UNESCO and they had the overarching kind of management, they would lease out different projects to different agencies. And getting those agencies to actually work with you was kind of tough. The biggest issue really was that a lot of the teachers just couldn't access the internet effectively. They had mobile phones, but they didn't have reliable access to the internet. I mean, it died because they couldn't really access the internet effectively.
All right.
Whereas the project in sub-Saharan Africa, again, I mean, if I could have continued in the way that I was hoping to continue in Jordan, maybe it would have continued. But what we did with that was essentially, instead of me setting it up, I said, as part of this project, well, have you heard of WhatsApp? Have you ever thought of setting up a WhatsApp group? and they did it. So I didn't set it up. I was, you know, a member from the beginning, but I didn't actually wasn't involved in setting it up, and it kind of blossoms from there. So, you know, you feed that in. So you try and you push at an open door rather than trying to, you know, build something completely from scratch. And, you know, this is, look at what's happening with all the discussion that we're having around, you know, tracker apps. You know, why not just use the existing stuff that's out there for the time being, get it up and running quickly, not worry too much about, you know, a lot of the issues to start with, like we did with Zoom. You know, quickly Zoom has got with the program, and, you know, we have the security features. Have we had any Zoom bombing? Have I missed it? You know,
Thankfully not.
Everybody worries about that kind of thing. And so, you know, there are security features in here now that weren't there before. So those things get resolved in this kind of world. So that's, you know, when people talk about disruptive technology, that's what it means, you know. So it changes the nature of it, forces the companies to do things in ways they hadn't necessarily thought about. So, you know, it's
I think it's dynamic, and the apps and the tools will be adapting to what is needed. And so
exactly.
Zoom is now realizing they need more security, and they're working on it.
But if you're going to do a project, you know, first ask people, you know, what they'd like to do. You know, it's kind of difficult sometimes to get funding for those kinds of projects, but, you know, there are funders that are more, you know, more thoughtful about those things. Ask people, you know, what they want to do. Ask them what technology they find useful, and then build the project around that, rather than trying to, you know, say, I've got the answer. Bang.
Yeah, that also helps the technophobic not to run away, because if you can get them on board using what they already know, it makes it much easier.
Indeed it does.
Yeah. Okay, do we have any more questions? Okay, we have one here. How easy it is to set a lesson on WhatsApp in terms of the GDPR limitations, and given that you need the personal phone number from the students?
Yeah, that's an issue. I can't deny that, and that's why I don't use WhatsApp with my students at the university, because we can't. So I use WeChat, and not just with the Chinese students. I use it with any students in the group. So my language learning and technology module, we set up a WeChat group, because you don't have to exchange telephone numbers. You know, there are issues still around, you know, where's that data going and who's using it and where's it stored and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the key thing that people worry about is giving out their phone numbers or you know, being identifiable, and WeChat doesn't need that. And so you set up a QR code, you give somebody your QR code, and they can make contact with you, and you can you don't have to sort of set up, so you can set up a group in WeChat without any exchange of anything, and you don't have to accept anybody as friends or any of those sorts of things.
Exactly.
Completely kind of, so if you're worried about GDPR and you can persuade people to use a different tool, and that's where the problem comes, then that's an issue. The other tool, that's
the other thing. Sometimes you suggest a tool, and people don't want to do another registration, another download,
and that is a problem. And the other tool, when I work with my undergraduate students at Manchester, I use Edmodo as an alternative, because it's a VLE that, you know, looks like social media, and I sort of blag them into doing it, because I say, well, this is what schools around the world use, you know, as part of, and they kind of buy into that. But yes, you have to be aware of that, and you have to be careful that you are ethical about these things. Absolutely, I wouldn't argue against that. So.
Okay, we have one more question, and it's about assessment, and it's how can learners be assessed online from...
Well, you know, there have been a number of sessions on this. There are quite a few. It's a difficult one. There's no two ways about it. Depends on what you mean by assessment, and it depends on where it's happening. It depends on whether it's happening in an asynchronous context or whether it's happening in a synchronous context. I mean, one of the things say, mention Graham again. One of the things that Graham talked about was actually recording. I think actually that was your colleague, Graham, who mentioned that. So actually recording sessions and then using that as a way of looking at spoken language. That's one way of doing it. Again, you have to get permission to do that. So that's an issue. Things like, obviously, there are multiple choice questions that are very easy to sort of set up and run if you have an asynchronous context. A lot of what we're doing in higher education is we're moving away from sort of sit down formal examinations to open book examinations. The talk I went to, a couple of talks I went to recently talked about e-portfolios. So e-portfolios were very much, something that was mentioned as being a way. So collecting examples of people's practice,
evidence of learning,
of engagement, which could be a variety of things. I mean, you've got tools like, again, if you are able to use tools like Google. You've got Google. I use Google quite a lot with my undergraduate students. So they do, joint assessment. So you can comment on that kind of thing. Even got some electronic marking in there as well. So it's you can't.
Well, the thing is, there are so many things to assess to. It depends what are you assessing.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you're assessing spoken language, then maybe recordings, or it could be audio recordings. People could record something on their mobile phone and send it to you. There are lots of ways of doing it, but it depends exactly what you're saying, Vicky. What is it you want to do? It's a big question.
Yeah.
But nobody's saying it's easy online. I'm not trying to.
No, definitely not. No.
It is the big difficulty, really. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a few suggestions in the text chat: Flipgrid for speaking and reading theory for reading. So you can get the links or the suggestions from the chat box. And I think it's time to be wrapping up, Sophia.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you very, very much, Gary, for being here. Thank you, everybody, for coming in. Thank you, the LTSIG committee, for always being so amazing. So stay for the next sessions on the virtual round table. There are quite a few interesting sessions. We were guests here, the LTSIG, the ITEP LTSIG for the virtual round table. So the LTSIG Fridays will be with you next week, same time, 3 o'clock UK time, with Vicky.
Oh, God. I closed the document. Is it Ellen? It's Ellen LaFall, I think.
It's Ellen next week.
So doing social learning.
Fantastic. So another interesting webinar next Friday, same time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gary. Take care.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everybody for coming. And
it was brilliant. Thanks.
If anybody has any questions or anything, you can email me or send me messages on what.
Good to see so many familiar faces.
Indeed. Okay,
so, hi, Kat. Thank you.